You can tell by looking at the shows that I choose to cover on this channel that I tend not to keep up with the current ones. But wanting to break this trend, I decided to check out Dana Terrace's The Owl House, hoping to maybe make a video about the show's 3rd season. And while I do still plan to do that, I have so many thoughts on the series that I needed to make a video about the first 40 episodes, as I'm going to somehow summarize my thoughts on nearly 15 hours of content, while touching at least somewhat on every single episode. Also, there will be heavy spoilers in this video. Like, heavy spoilers. Seriously, I'm going to talk about the final scene of the 2nd season in this video, so if you haven't seen the show, then don't watch the video. Instead, go watch the show, as small spoilers for the video, it's really good. Anyway, I have a ton to say and would like to keep this video relatively short, so apologies if any of it seems a bit rushed.
Oh dear child, I'm not like you.
Let's start this video off from the beginning of the series itself, the premiere episode, A Lying Witch and a Warden. It's a pretty classic case of good premiere, mediocre episode. Having your first episode being enjoyable within itself is exceptionally difficult, and nearly no cartoons ever really manage to pull it off. So I don't really blame the show for it, but if you go back and watch this episode after finishing the series, you'll find the characters are nearly unrecognizable, stiff versions of themselves. However, I would still describe it as a good premiere, as it doesn't really try to establish every single recurrent character in the show, instead focusing on 3 in particular: King, Eda, and the protagonist of the show, Luz and Amity. All 3 of these characters start off pretty solidly within their stereotypes, Luz being a classic quirky protagonist, Eda being the off-the-wall fun aunt, and King being the comic relief, but the next 6 or so episodes of the show focus more on introducing new characters rather than building up the ones we already have. While I get this approach, it leaves Eda, and especially King, in a rough spot for the season. In fact, I would say there really isn't a good King episode until season 2, and Eda's refusal to make any real effort to help Luz makes her character a bit hard to swallow early on, like in Witches Before Wizards, where Eda just ignores Luz until she almost gets herself killed. In general, season 1 Eda and King are rough, at least until the last couple episodes.
Oh, you're a witch! Do magic! Oh, I don't use magic!
Meanwhile, the main focus of multiple episodes early in the season are to introduce Hexside and its 3 most important characters, Gus, Willow, and Amity. I'm going to do a deep dive on all 3 of these characters in this video, but since this arc is the least reliant on others, let's start with Augustus Porter himself. Gus's arc is all about his search for acceptance, as shown through his 3 spotlight episodes. First up is the 9th episode of the show, Something Ventured, Something Framed. This episode is one of the weakest of the show. It's not terrible, but any plot revolving around a character lying to a friend at the beginning of an episode before hilariously trying to keep them from discovering the truth, which the show loves to do, is sure to get me to complain in this video. But really, this episode is just bland. It retreads a bit on I Was a Teenage Abomination, and AmpleSamuel is perhaps the dullest quote-unquote villain in the show. It's not the worst episode in the series. I think I would give that title to Once Upon a Swap or Sense and Insensitivity, but it's definitely not one of the peaks of the series. Gus wanting to fit into the Human Appreciation Society so much he betrayed the trust of his new friend is a bit hypocritical, and I think the show benefits in the long run from him getting kicked out of it at the end of the episode. Gus spends the rest of season 1 as one of Luz's sidekicks, and he fits pretty well in the role. He's a pretty decent comedic relief when King's not around, and I think he works great with the quiet Willow. It's not until season 2 that we get the second Gus episode, Through the Looking Glass Ruins. This episode has a subplot that becomes the main plot revolving around Luz and Amity, but for now I'm going to focus on the Gus stuff. It's a very similar theme to the last episode, this time with Gus trying to fit in with a group of Glandis students. It's a slightly better subplot than we got in Gus's last episode, but it's still one of the duller character arcs in the show. Don't get me wrong, I love Gus, but every time he gets a focus episode, it ends up feeling pretty similar. The Glandis students' betrayal is ridiculously sudden and predictable, and the episode decides to be a story way too late. At least the animation for the illusion at the end of the episode is neat, but especially paired with the spectacular Luz and Amity story, it's hard not to want the episode to constantly switch stories whenever Gus is on screen. The last Gus focus episode doesn't have this problem, as right before the effective 3-part season finale, we get Labyrinth Runners, which while it does have a tiny focus on Willow and Amity, largely focuses on Gus and Hunter. And while I really wanted to like this episode, and it is a good episode, but its placement in the show just isn't great. It's a necessary episode to focus on Hexside students, since they likely won't get another focus in the shortened season 3, and the mass illusion created by Gus is really sick, but following 2 of the best episodes in the series and coming right before the 3-part season finale leaves this looseless episode in a bit of a rough spot. It's a pretty good time, but it's hard to enjoy this episode for what it is, which is a pretty standard episode injected with high stakes. It's barely even a Gus episode too, as while the focus is initially on him, Hunter is the one who actually learns anything. It's a good episode, unfortunately surrounded by fantastic ones. Gus as a character isn't exactly enthralling, but that's not entirely a bad thing. The L House is loaded with intensely interesting characters, as I'll get to later on in this video, so it's not exactly the end of the world that Gus doesn't have too much going on. His plots provide some interesting ideas regarding the theme of acceptance, but his episodes regarding that theme tend to be on the weaker side. Anyways, that's all I want to say about Gus, so let's move to his partner in crime, Willow.
I'm interested in something with a little more drama, flair, and face paint.
Willow is the first side character introduced in the show, and fittingly, she is the first focused episode with I Was a Teenage Abomination. This episode is early enough to still be somewhat focused on establishing Luz as the protagonist, as well as also being Amity and Gus's introduction, but the largest focus on the episode is still on Willow herself. The episode itself, though, is kind of I mean, it has some great set pieces, but the characters still have yet to find themselves, mostly focusing on her transition to the plant track, but there's still enough about her interactions with Amity to set up their arc later in the season. Willow spends the bulk of Season 1 as part of Luz's gang along with Gus, a role she fits into pretty well. The Willow of early Season 1 definitely has a bit too much overlap with Gus, but she works well as a quasi-foil for Luz. Honestly though, Willow remains pretty boring until our next focus episode, Understanding Willow, the first fantastic episode in the show. Everything comes together in this one, the concepts are sick, the backgrounds are fantastic, and the story arc actually feels like it works with the magical elements instead of just running parallel with them. This episode fully explains Willow and Amity's backstory and really makes you feel terrible for what Willow had to go through prior to Luz's arrival. While the reveal that Amity was forced to stop being friends with her feels like a bit of a cop-out, it was definitely necessary to quickly redeem Amity like the show needed to. Anyway, the setting of Willow's mind definitely borrows a bit from Gravity Falls' Dreamscaperers, which I promise is the only Gravity Falls mention I'll make in this video, but it's a great concept and I think it works anyway. I really like the decision to not have Willow fully forgive Amity at the end of this one, although in effect she practically does in terms of their friendship throughout the remainder of the show. Overall, I really like this one. Wing It Like Witches follows a couple episodes later, another quasi-Willow tale, this time about learning to stand up for herself. This episode does kind of evolve into an Amity one towards the end, something I'll get to in the Amity section of this video, but the beginning at least shows Willow's newfound confidence after the events of the last two episodes. I'm gonna wait to give my full verdict on this episode until I talk about it from an Amity lens, so let's go ahead and move on to Flawless at the Coven Day Parade, which, while not really a Willow episode, features a scene I really want to talk about, which is Amity approaching Willow for advice regarding Luz. It's a quiet scene, but I really do love it. Willow working out will always be somehow sick and cute, and it's nice to see Amity talking to Willow one-on-one. The show does tend to stick to a Luz perspective, even if it's not as bad as some other cartoons, but it's rare to see her friends without her. It's a really cute scene, and definitely the highlight of the episode. Amity and Willow's friendship gets one last focus in Labyrinth Runners, where Amity has to learn to trust Willow's ability to take care of herself. It's a really small B-plot, but in the limited time it has, it works really well, becoming the better plot of the episode. Seeing Willow go beast mode is a joy to watch, and the short screen time lets Amity's ignorance not seem obscene. Watching Willow's progression from a bumbling Abomination's failure to one of the strongest witches in the show is really fun, and her soft aggression is constantly a source for some of my favorite jokes in the show. But Willow is not my favorite of Luz's friends. She's definitely a source of consistent quality within the show, and her character fits shockingly well as both a focus and as a sidekick for Luz-focused adventures.
Because today, I'm saving Eda.
While some of Season 1 feels a bit fillery, like Hootie's moving hassle and really small problems, the season kicks in into high gear as it ends with 5 consecutive fantastic episodes. We've already talked about Understanding Willow and Wing It Like Witches, and I'll get to Grum a bit later, but I want to focus on the effective 2-part Season 1 finale, kicking off with Agony of a Witch. This episode opens by immediately setting up the stakes, showing that Lilith is going to make one final push towards capturing her sister. Lilith's appearance throughout Season 1 had been a bit underwhelming, as she's almost a gag character, but her depiction in this one is significantly more threatening. The first half of the episode is fine, feeling pretty standard for the show. The episode begins to pick up as soon as we get this terrifying moment out of nowhere.
This hat back before anyone knows it's gone.
I will know.
Lilith approaching the kids is horrifying, and Gus and Willow notifying Eda feels like the first complete tone shift in the show. The actual witches duel that follows is absolutely terrific. Seriously, one of the best fights I've ever seen in a non-action show. The choreography is excellent, the dialogue is immaculate, the music is mystical, the animation is buttery smooth, and it all comes together to create the best fight of the first 2 seasons. The ending to this episode is also fantastic, as Eda is captured and Luz is left with seemingly nothing. The episode that follows, Young Blood Old Soul, roles was a bit of a downgrade, largely due to the slow start. While the beginning of the episode feigns a continuation of the tone from the last one, it quickly slips back into juvenile humor, which, while I usually appreciate it, it doesn't really fit in this episode. Don't get me wrong though, this episode is still a good season finale, as it definitely starts to pick up once Luz meets up with Eda. While knowing that it's not actually a goodbye softens the blow, Eda giving Luz the door is still a gut punch. Seeing Luz's visceral anger towards Lilith is a really fun angle for the character, and the bold move to have the fight shift to the human realm definitely pays off. Eda and Lilith's backstory does feel a bit out of place, as it completely slows down the action-packed finale, but it still works fairly well. Luz's encounter with Belos is handled fantastically here, as they keep him a mysteriously seemingly omnipresent force while still letting Luz get the upper hand. Lilith using the pain sharing spell is really clever by the writers, as introducing it during the flashback blends it in pretty well. Overall, it's a great season 1 finale. It definitely sets up the more heavily serialized second season, really ramping up the story that had been building throughout the first one. It's a fantastic cap on a good season, and introduces many plot elements that are expanded upon in the show's sophomore set of episodes. Speaking of which, season 2 brings with it a couple of new status quo alterations that affect pretty much every plot, those being that Lilith has moved into the Owl House, that Lilith and Eda cannot use magic, and that Luz no longer has access to the magic door, meaning that Eda's main source of income, scamming the locals with human artifacts, is also no longer an option. All of these come to a head in the season 2 premiere separate tides. These changes all immediately take effect as Eda becomes a complete non-threat as a result of losing her powers, and the Owl House is forced to take bounties for snails. This change creates a way more dire tone throughout the season, as the most powerful witch in the Boiling Isles is not always there just to save the day. The episode itself is pretty mediocre, but the plots that it sets up definitely end up paying off later in the season. Other threads that begin here include the pairing of Hooty and Lilith, which is actually pretty consistently enjoyable. Both of these characters become comedic relief in this season, so their pairing allows for some satisfying B-plots in the same vein as King's in the first season.
You two shall regret ever doubting me. We're going to my castle.
Speaking of King, his character is treated as something beyond comedic relief this season. Sure, technically there was some, albeit subpar, character stuff they tried to do with him in the first season, such as really small problems, but most of the plots revolving around him, such as I Was a Teenage Abomination, The Intruder, or Escape of the Palisman, end up being comedic romps that tend to fall flat in their face. In these plots, it's generally pretty hard to side with King, as he's kind of a jerk in the first season. From abusing Eda's curse to trying to make Luz's friends disappear, it's kind of a strange dynamic between him and the other members of the Owl House. It doesn't help that his character wasn't really entirely figured out until the second season, but it's pretty hard to find King subplots that I actually enjoyed in the first season. This doesn't carry into season 2, however, as King gets a couple of fantastic spotlight episodes, starting with Echoes of the Past. King's arc this season revolves around his search for and acceptance of his past. This eventually turns into a discussion surrounding identity, as you can see through his name. King's entire self-worth was built on his view of his history as the Demon King. Anyway, this episode is really solid. Lilith and Hooty's dynamic is still fresh and fantastic, and Luz and Eda's attempts to protect King from the truth are really well written. The flashbacks are well done, the action is really solid, and the slow trickle of knowledge is satisfying, instead of feeling that the show is just stalling for 22 minutes. The end of the episode is really sweet too, with King beginning to accept that the show is about found family. Seriously though, the next King moment I want to talk about is at the end of Eda's Requiem, an episode I'm going to go over extensively in the Eda portion of this video. The entire episode is about Eda hiding from King, seemingly telling her that he's gonna leave the Owl House, and going through some pretty traumatic stuff in the process. It's this situation that sets up King announcing that he's taking on her last name, and Eda's reaction to this leads to it hitting like a truck. Seriously, the vocal performances in the scene are immaculate, and even after seeing it dozens of times, the scene makes me a bit emotional every single watch. I do think this moment comes a bit early in the season, but it works well in both the context of Eda's struggles throughout the episode and contextualizes King's search for his father. It was beginning to feel like King was looking for his father so he can go to his, quote, real family, so I have a feeling this was to mitigate that. Anyway, more on this episode in a bit, but let's go ahead and move on to the next King story, which again takes place in a not King episode. I'm going to end up talking about knock knock knocking on Hooty's door 4 times in this video. Luckily, the King part is first, and the first one I'm going to talk about. A King and Hooty subplot in the first season usually meant that Eda and Luz were busy doing something cool, and the episode sometimes had to cut away from that in order to have the same gag revolving around the juxtaposition of King's attitude of royalty and his small stature over and over and over again. Here, while there definitely is some of that, and there is more of a comedic element when compared to other sections in this episode, the ending works really well dramatically. I will say this is unfortunately the weakest section of this episode, as the resolution is seemingly that King gets a cool new power and forgets about everything else, but don't get me wrong, it is still good, but it's placed in one of the strongest episodes of the show, and the ending struggles a bit. The next episode I want to talk about is Edge of the World, which finally reveals the full-ish truth behind King's backstory. The episode itself is really clever with how it slowly reveals the truth behind the Titan Hunters, and the scenery in this episode is up there with the best in the show. King's complete joy in finding his people before realizing that not only are they not actually his people, but that they are responsible for the genocide of his species is brutal to watch, and the show doesn't really pull any punches. Okay, that's a lie, there are quite a few punches pulled, but the episode is still fantastic. Hootie and Luz work really well as side characters, King is the most sympathetic that he's ever been the entire series, and the ending of the episode doesn't try to be all sunshine and rainbows as King looks wistfully at the corpse of his father, finally accepting that he'll never meet him. Edge of the World doesn't really have time to go into King's psyche after this revelation, as that has to wait until the final episode I want to talk about in this section, O Titan, Where Art Thou? Besides the collector dream stuff, this episode's King focus is about how King reacts to finally getting confirmation of his power. All of his subplots in the first season were about wanting respect and power, and now that he has it, he feels more hopeless than ever. Fittingly, the show uses another past joke character, Steve, to help King come to the realization that power wasn't all he thought it would be. I think that I would have expanded on this point more, but I still like how the show lets King get away from Luz and Eda in order to reflect on the life-altering revelations that King has gone through throughout the entire season. King's arc in the second half is the perfect example of how to have a serious arc revolve around a character usually used for jokes. A lot of shows try to do something similar and fail utterly, so it's really impressive for the show to turn the somewhat annoying King of the first season into one of the hardest hitting parts of the second season, all without it feeling like it betrays his character. Even if his arc doesn't have as much time as the other two characters, something that occasionally causes it to feel a bit rushed, it still stands out as a consistent highlight of the show's latter half.
I wake up someplace dark, and then it appears.
Speaking of Eda, I'm splitting her part of season 2 into two sections, the first of which being her conflict with the Owl Beast and her parents. After I kicked off the season 1 finale, the idea of curing Eda's curse instead of just dealing with it carries into this season, as it's the only thing on Gwendolyn's mind when she arrives at the Owl House and keeping up appearances. This episode is mostly focused on Eda's mother instead of Eda herself, as the show does an admittedly clever take on elderly scams. This episode kind of presents Gwen in a shockingly bad light though. Like, obviously she has good intentions, but she completely ignores Lilith to the point where she becomes a monster, and then proceeds to take all the elixir that could help her children in order to prove a point or something. The redemption at the end of the episode is a bit quick, but the action is good and there's enough solid writing at the end to tie the episode up. Sending Lilith home helps her get out of the way for a few episodes, and it also helps redeem Gwen enough that she can end the episode in good standing. It's a solid episode, but still one of the weaker ones of the season. While Eda's experience with her mother this season was given its own episode, her father's is instead split into two episodes, the first of which being the second segment of Knock Knock Knockin' on Hootie's Door. Eda's section of this episode is largely about her making a truce with the owl beast inside of her, but before that occurs, the episode takes some time to show some examples of the owl beast negatively affecting her, including when she mauled her own father. The scene is surprisingly dark, especially when taking in the context of seeing Dell a few episodes later. It becomes obvious what actual damage Eda did here. It would be remiss of me not to mention the beautiful visuals during this scene, as well as the entire section of the episode. The colors are all beautiful, and the storytelling is next level. Despite the fact that it's only Eda talking, Eda's conversation with the owl beast is one of the most beautiful scenes in the show. Eda finally comes to term with her curse, accepting it as a part of her, and her new form symbolizes this. It's a beautiful 8 minutes. Not only is it likely the best the show has ever looked, but it also has some of the best writing in the series. Even if Eda has come to terms with her curse, her father's reappearance in Elsewhere and Elsewhen demonstrates that she still fully hasn't accepted what she did under the curse. The first half of the subplot where Eda just meanders around isn't ideal, but the conversation with her father is immaculate. The guilt that Eda feels bleeds throughout this entire scene, and while there is eventually a somewhat happy ending, the episode doesn't pretend that everything's okay. The episode shows how weak Dell is after Eda's attack, as his hands are still clearly heavily affected. It's a really nice scene in an otherwise pretty boring episode, but I'll get to the rest of this episode in a bit. For now, the conversation with her father puts Eda's relationship with her family and curse in a good place for the rest of the series. After the curse played such a large role in the season finale, season 2 had to put an emphasis on it, and using Eda's parents was a great way to handle it. While I think I would have included Lilith just a bit more, perhaps having a full episode this season about the sisters instead of just a subplot here and there, I still really like this arc.
You're lying again. It's like I don't really know you.
The other Eda plot this season is about her and Raine Whispers. While they were teased a bit in season 1, Raine's first real appearance is in Eda's Requiem, which happens to be my personal favorite episode of these first 40. There's so much about this episode that I love. I already talked about how much I love King changing his name, but that scene is made even better with the context of this entire episode being about Eda's fear of losing her found family. The setup of Eda fearing that she will once again be alone sets up the reappearance of Raine so well. Raine's introduction is done terrifically, as it's immediately made clear that it weren't exactly the evil coven leader that we're used to seeing in the show. Seeing Eda and Raine hang out for the first time in years is really fun, and the rest of that batch make for fantastic side characters. Seeing characters plan out elaborate heists is always a good time, but the episode begins to pick up immensely once Eda and Raine are separated from the rest of their team. The namesake song of the episode is fantastic, and the different versions of it have entirely different tones, despite all being essentially the same melody. The visuals during every single one is great, and Eda and Raine have a fantastic chemistry between them. Even with the mega emotional live stream that I mentioned before, I still think that the final rendition of Eda's Requiem is my favorite part of the episode. While it's likely for censorship reasons, the audience having to slowly realize that Eda is trying to sacrifice her life is done really well. I mean, it's one of the darkest scenes of the entire season, as Raine has to stop Eda from making a bad decision. It's this context that makes King's announcement at the end of the episode so perfect, as it proves that Eda was wrong, and while Luz and King may eventually leave the Owl House, they will always be her family. Being my favorite of the entire series, I think it's fairly obvious that I find this episode to be a perfect start to Raine's appearance in the show. Anyway, the next Raine appearance is a tiny flashback and knocking on Hootie's door. Its main purpose is just to show another example of the Owl Beast coming out at the worst time, but it gives context to why Raine and Eda broke up. This context is necessary in order to fully understand the next Raine episode, Follies of the Coven Day Parade. This episode is largely about Luz, as Raine and Eda don't actually meet until right towards the end, but their scenes together, as you can probably guess, is fantastic. Watching Eda slowly realize that Raine doesn't remember any of the events of Eda's Requiem is heartbreaking, and if you rewatch the episode knowing that Raine was faking to protect her, it becomes even more so. It's a great scene that further shows how great these characters are. Finally, the last episode I want to talk about in this section is Them's the Breaks Kid. Obviously, I know there's more Eda and Raine later, but I'm saving the finale stuff for a later section. Anyway, this episode is a really cool concept and has some really cool moments. But, okay, this one isn't great. While I love the scenes in the present day at the beginning and ends of the episode, the actual flashback tends to be on the boring side for me. No giant action sequence, emotional heartbreak, or hilarious comedy, just kind of a lot of plot. Eda and Raine don't really have any of the chemistry that they have in the modern day. I think I would have really preferred a story that takes place further in their relationship, but I don't really have much to say about this one, besides that I like the character design of the younger versions of the Cawthorn sisters. Despite my lukewarm review of the last episode, I really do love a lot that Raine and Eda story has to offer. Raine is the perfect pairing with Eda, perfectly bringing out her soft side in a similar vein to Luz and King. The music that comes with an arc surrounding a bard is obviously great, and I find a lot of the Raine scenes to have some of the best visuals in the show as well. While it might not be my favorite pairing in the show, Raine is a fantastic addition to the series.
Studying with Willow and Gus and maybe even Amity. Amity, oh cramity!
Speaking of my favorite pairing in the show, I think I've avoided mentioning it for long enough. It's finally time for me to talk about Amity and Luz. Because there are so many episodes with them, I'm going to group a few of them together in order to save some time. The first 3 episodes I'm going to group together are unsurprisingly the first 3 Amity episodes in the series, with I Was a Teenage Abomination, Convention, and Hootie's Moving Hassle. Besides these 3 all just being fairly mediocre to somewhat good episodes, they also all have another thing in common, setting up the fact that Amity hates Luz. I mean really hates her, and I think the show handles this really well. Obviously it's not as fun to see Amity at odds with Luz as to see them team up, but the show makes the decision to have Amity's disdain for our protagonist be quite reasonable. I mean Luz, while accidentally, is constantly screwing things up for Amity, so it makes sense why they wouldn't be buddies from the start. Still, as I mentioned before, it's not exactly great to come back to these episodes after watching the rest of the series. So while this trio of episodes is definitely necessary in order to make the couple not seem completely fabricated or rushed, I'm glad they don't extend this period of Lumity. And yes, I hate hearing myself use a ship name as much as you do. Coming after these episodes is what I would call the first turning point in the Amity and Luz relationship, being Lost in Language. This episode is actually pretty solid. Besides just introducing the best side characters in the entire show, the Blight twins, this episode is also just really well constructed. The magic in this episode is some of the coolest in the show, and the action sequence at the end has some nice choreography, and the use of the Azura series to find a connection between Luz and Amity is excellent. So besides another rather lame King and Eda subplot, this episode is a great real beginning to Lumity. And next up on the docket are Adventures in the Elements, The First Day, and Understanding Willow. Adventures in the Elements is an odd one. On one hand, this episode is one of my favorites of the first season. While Eda can be a bit difficult to watch, and the cringe comedy is a bit too strong at times, the scenery is beautiful and the action is terrific. On the other hand, the way that Amity acts is just so odd in this one. I don't mean so odd like in how Amity usually acts around Luz, but like odd in that she feels like a different character. It's hard to explain, but the Amity in this episode is just weird. Like she locks Luz in a cage and just continuously says things that don't really make any sense. So while this is a good episode, it's not really a good episode for Amity and Luz, if that makes any sense at all. After acting weird in a normal Amity way towards Luz in The First Day, an episode with great side characters and a mediocre plot, the next extended Amity and Luz episode is an Understanding Willow. I already talked extensively about why this episode is so great earlier in the video, but just to add to that, I think this episode was necessary in order to have Amity and Luz's relationship actually happen. Having our protagonist dating somebody who is nasty towards Willow would likely have felt off, so I think having this episode come at this point in the series was almost required in order for the show to commit to doing Lumity. Speaking of which, the big Luz and Amity episode of the first season, and perhaps the show, was up next with Enchanting Grom Fright. This episode is really stinking good. The concept of a monster that appears as your worst fear isn't exactly original, but this episode's take on it is. Seeing Luz prepare for the fight against Grom is fun, but the episode becomes a masterpiece once the actual dance begins. Seeing Luz fail feels a bit weird for the show, but it makes perfect sense. Luz spends the episode trying to use Grom to ignore her fear of her mother's disapproval, so the episode would obviously feel completely off if she was able to defeat Grom on her own. Of course, had Luz just won outright, we also wouldn't have gotten the fantastic Luz and Amity dance. Sure, it doesn't really make sense how they were able to pull this off with no practice, or why they really even did it, but who cares, it's just so terrific. The choreography is masterful, the animation is ridiculously smooth, and the music is fittingly really well done. The only complaint that I could possibly have is that it's too short, but it might have felt a bit artificially extended if it was any longer. Overall, yeah, this episode is truly terrific. Enchanted Grom Fright shows and capitalizes on the full potential of Lumity and the Owl House by extension. We're not quite done with season 1 yet, as Wing It Like Witches has some great Amity moments too, eventually becoming somewhat of a spotlight episode. Again, just as Amity apologizing to Willow was necessary for Lumity to progress, so was her fully standing up against her former friends. Again, as I mentioned before, it's a great episode, and Amity's sports line is arguably the cutest Lumity moment of the first season.
Oh, wow, sports.
After conveniently shelving Amity for the season 1 finale, and after showing the aftermath of that finale in the season 2 premiere, Lumity is back in action with a trilogy of episodes showing the progression of their relationship, escaping expulsion through Looking Glass Ruins, and knock knock knocking on Hootie's door. Escaping expulsion feels like a very season 1 episode from the beginning. Luz and her friends being expelled in general is an early show plot, and the way that Luz ends up trying to solve that problem follows suit. Anyway, there is some stuff to like in this episode, like a great action sequence at the end, but it's a weird, somewhat forgettable episode at the beginning of the season. Through the Looking Glass Ruins is definitely a Gus episode, but the moment that most people remember from this one comes in the Lumity subplot. Both Luz and Amity inside the library are more boneheaded than usual, but I think it fits the plot and makes sense contextually. Besides perhaps Luz screaming at the mouse at the end, I really don't have any issue with how these characters behave during this episode. Amity's new hair for the second season, similar to Willow's later in the season, shows a significant change in her character as she fully distances herself from her mother and stops trying to live up to her expectations. The scene that follows is obviously great too, but I don't really think I need to explain that. I always love Amity questioning herself after an interaction with Luz. Luz's little drop in line with the music is great, and Ed's comment after is also gold. Anyway, in case you haven't gotten tired of me talking about it, we are once again returning to knock knock knocking on Hootie's door, this time for the final time. The third and last plot of the episode revolves around, you guessed it, Luz and Amity. From Hootie straight up kidnapping Amity to the hilariously messed up tunnel of love, this is about as funny as the show ever gets. Of course, the awkward energy of Luz and Amity trying to ask each other out is both hard to watch and a joy to watch. While squeezing this into an episode only somewhat about them feels like it would be a bit off, because Amity already kissed Luz 3 episodes prior, this really didn't need to be treated as a huge moment within the show. Still, it's very enjoyable and caps off a great episode fantastically. Eclipse Lake, Fall Eyes at the Coven Day Parade, and Any Sport in a Storm are all non-Lumity episodes that have some Lumity in them. Eclipse Lake does it through separating them physically, Coven Day Parade does it through separating them emotionally, and Any Sport in a Storm does it by having them go on a low-stakes adventure together. Out of these 3 episodes, Eclipse Lake is easily my favorite. Besides just some plot stuff, which I'll get to towards the end of the video, it's also really nice to see how much Luz and Amity care about each other. King helping Amity see what Luz actually meant was a nice scene, and their embrace at the end of the episode is fantastic. Seeing Amity and Luz fight together at the parade is nice, and it's also cool to see them in an adventure not directly about their relationship, but Any Sport in a Storm. All 3 of these are non-Lumity episodes, but the Amity and Luz stuff within them is a constant highlight of the episode. What follows of the Coven Day Parade played around with doing it a bit. Reaching Out is the first and as of now only episode to be about a struggle in Luz's relationship. Despite having the most adorable Lumity moment in the show, the episode eventually develops into Luz lying to Amity and getting her in trouble, harkening back to season 1. I'm glad the show never threatens breaking them up like it easily could have, and their conversation regarding Luz's grief about her father has the best written Luz dialogue and arguably the best delivery in the show. Hearing Luz's voice crack as she describes how much she misses her mother is heartbreaking, and Amity's reaction to it is animated perfectly. The soft energy of the final scene is a heartwarmer too, being a nice calm final moment between the characters before the chaos of the season finale. Luz trying to attack the Abomatron is a bit too far for my taste, but the rest of the episode, from the loud and rambunctious brawls to the quiet conversations, is truly and utterly terrific. Speaking of the season finale, I'm gonna say most of it for the final section, something I swear I will not say again in this video, but I obviously gotta talk about the big Lumity finale for the season. After Luz eventually gives in to her urge to go save her girlfriend, we get a somewhat corny but worth it scene with Amity and her siblings. It's nice to see Amity talk about Luz when she's not around, just like we see Luz talk about her all the time. Their reunion is, not surprisingly, really well done. The increase in animation quality is ridiculous, and Luz saying crikey is infinitely funny. It's the only real quiet moment in the last 44 minutes of the show, and while it's a bit of a weird fit, I think it works well enough. Overall, Luz and Amity really surprised me. Usually romance is something that bores in cartoons, but here I think Luz and Amity have some of the best episodes in the entire series. I can see why there'd be complaints about this couple. It is kind of rushed when looking at it from face value, but in a show as short as the Owl House will end up being, you really don't have time to show a long, drawn-out build-up to a relationship. Really, I even think they paced it pretty well, having them friendly at the end of Season 1A, practically dating by the end of Season 1B, actually dating by the end of Season 2A, and fully together by the end of 2B. Lumity is filled with some of the best moments in the show, some of the goofiest moments in the show, and a lot of overlap. Watching Amity change so drastically from her appearance is really fun to watch, partially just because of how well it's handled. I don't really feel like it's my place to talk about it from a representation standpoint, but from a writing standpoint, Luz and Amity's relationship is one of, if not the strongest element in the entire series. Whether given its own episode or stuffed in a subplot, Lumity constantly manages to stand out in a show filled with expansive lore and intricate plot. Speaking of which,
We'll take things one day at a time.
Alright, I've pretty much covered Season 1 and every main character arc, so now all that's left is Season 2's story. While I am going to cover a ton of episodes here, I've already touched on aspects of most of these, so we should be able to fly through a few. Anyway, this video is already longer than I wanted it to be, so let's go ahead and get started with Separate Tides. I already talked about pretty much every part of the episode, besides the ending with the new character of Season 2, the Golden Guard. While he was teased a bit in the first season, this is his real first episode, and I think it's pretty solid. It definitely sets him up to be a persistent but beatable threat. I decided not to give Hunter its own section during this video, so I guess I'll go over him here. In general, I think his character was a good addition to the show. While one could call Amity's arc one of redemption, I think Hunter is a good excuse for the show to fully have one. While I think I would have personally had him feature a bit more prominently in Season 1, his character is written well, his plots are enjoyable, and his conversion to the good guys actually makes sense, so no complaints here. Anyway, let's get back to the actual episodes with Hunting Palisman, which is a pretty good episode too. Hard to come up with new ways to say I like an episode at this point. It's not one of the top episodes in the series, but actually seeing Hunter as Hunter sets up his arc for the rest of the show. Seeing the characters get their Palisman is nice, the action in the ship is cool, and Hunter's first step towards redemption is done fairly well. Luz talking about missing her mother also sets up the next two episodes I want to talk about nicely. Eclipse Lake is up next, and as I mentioned before, it's another one of my favorites from the series. The Lumity stuff is great, but the Hunter stuff is stellar too. It's cool to see him basically go from comedic relief to an actual threat when usually the show goes the other way. His fight with Amity is beautiful too, easily the best of the second season. It's incredibly smooth, has great choreography, and the contrast in their fighting styles works really well. Hunter threatening Luz in order to get the key makes sense, and it allows the show to let Hunter win while not making the odd concession that he's stronger than Amity. Solid episode that leads well into Luz finally building the door back to the human realm. Speaking of which, Yesterday's Lie is a really weird episode, like perhaps the weirdest episode of the show weird. Not in its themes or concepts, but more in its structure and vibe. That's not really me saying it's bad or anything, in fact I would say that it's a good episode, but it feels off for the show. The reflection angle is really neat, and V's story is a cool one to tell, even if both are a bit unnecessary for the story and a substantial letdown from the fantastic Dark Luz tease. The conspiracy guy is also a bit too cliche for the show's standards, and if Luz's mom's promise ends up actually being a plot point in Season 3, eventually, then you will get to hear me complain about it. Anyway, weird premise, weird structure, concerning ending, good episode. I already talked about the Raine and Amity stuff and Fall to the Coven Day Parade, and the Kikimora stuff never really materializes in anything worth more of a mention in this video, so I'm really just going to talk about Belos' speech at the end of the episode. The moment is quietly a really pivotal one for the show, and I think they really nail it. It really sets up the tone for the rest of the season as the show transitions from being mostly about Luz getting home to mostly being about stopping the Emperor. Speaking of Belos, I really haven't talked about him as a villain yet either. It sure is crazy how long you can talk about a show and not really mention the antagonist, huh? Anyway, the Emperor is a good villain that gets intensely upgraded by the events of Elsewhere and Elsewind and Hollow Mind. Elsewhere and Elsewind is a pretty mediocre episode by itself, and I think the reveal that Philip is Belos at the end could have been omitted to lead to a better moment in Hollow Mind, but whatever. Either way, Hollow Mind is a top 3 episode in the series. I love it when shows revisit a concept in a completely different light, and despite this episode's similarity to Understanding Willow, they couldn't be more different tonally. The beginning to this episode is a bit slow, but watching Hunter and Luz break down the various revelations in this episode are fantastic. The visuals are fantastic, the performances are legendary, and the ending is immaculate. It's Hunter's best episode, it's Belos' best episode, and it's top 3 for both Luz and the series. I know I'm going a bit out of order here, but I have very similar thoughts on Any Sport in a Storm and Labyrinth Runners, so I thought I'd group them together here. Both these episodes are ones I've touched on before, but I want to focus on what they do for Hunter here. Hunter is still a villain after Any Sport in a Storm, and is practically good before Labyrinth Runners, so it's not really a pivotal character turn for him. Labyrinth Runners is probably more pivotal as it fully aligns him with our main characters, but as I mentioned before, it's a good episode surrounded by fantastic ones. I've talked a lot in this video about certain episodes being a character's best, and I think that Eda's best is O Titan, Where Art Thou? It stings watching her try her best to protect Luz, both physically and from knowing how dire the situation truly is. Luz wanting to help King is adorable, and it's heartbreaking watching our 2 main characters have to fight. The fight itself isn't super entertaining visually, but it's a fantastic written scene. The ending with the cats is cool too, and sets up a massive season finale. First though, in Clouds on the Horizon, Luz has to go on a quote, romantic rescue mission. I already talked about their kiss, so I'll skip towards the confrontation with Amity's parents and Kikimora. Odalia is perhaps the most hateable antagonist in the show, and that's saying a lot when Belos is literally trying to commit genocide. It's really enjoyable to watch her get completely annihilated by her husband, and leaving her unredeemed for now I think is a good choice. Watching King and Aldor talk is hilarious, and despite just being a funny reveal, I really do like Luz sacrificing herself to help Hunter and Eda. It really does fit perfectly with her character, showing how willing she is to do anything to help her friends. Meanwhile, Eda getting a Coven sigil is a really powerful moment for the series. Throughout the show, Eda has represented lawlessness in the show, and in the end, she too eventually has to give in and join the Coven structure. It's a little understated in the episode for my taste, but I still really like the scene. Anyway, if you can believe it, after like 30 minutes of awkwardly rambling, we're finally at the last episode I haven't mentioned yet. The season 2 finale, King's Tide. After some really nice character stuff with Willow on the airship and a sweet Hootie and Lilith moment, we finally get to see the Emperor again. And this time it's even better. The fight itself is visceral, and having Luz brand Belos is a really clever way to turn the tide of the fight. And once the rest of Luz's friends show up, the choreography becomes really stellar. Every character gets a chance to land some attacks on the Emperor, and the Luz Amity combo attack in the middle is really impressive visually. I also like the decision to cut in Raine saving Eda in the middle of the fight. It both adds an emotionally well written scene to the episode and raises the tension of the fight against the Emperor. Meanwhile, while the kids are presumably getting thrashed by Belos up top, King goes down to talk to immediate fan favorite, the Collector. And yeah, besides just having one of the sickest designs I've ever seen, his chaotic energy is just really fun for the show. The song that plays when he destroys the main antagonist of the series is one of my favorite character themes of all time, and the scene itself is just great. I really like how it gives King a chance to save the day, and watching the kids try to improvise what the Owl House is as a game is a nice bit of comic relief in this pretty heavy episode. Speaking of pretty heavy, the ending to this episode is just that. Watching Luz have to leave King and Eda to seemingly die at the hands of the Collector is heartbreaking, and the song that kicks in as the kids realize they are trapped back in the human realm away from their friends and family really leaves the season on a somber note. Seeing Luz finally get what she wanted this whole season, to be back in the human realm with her mom, really brings it all full circle, as she is still completely miserable. The season 3 finale is obviously fantastic. It's action-packed, beautiful, emotional, and sets up a season 3 really well. Every main character gets something to do, and the Collector's first impression is one of the most memorable moments from the show. King's Tide is truly one of the greatest season finales in a cartoon that I can remember. This is the point in the video where I would usually conclude, but I think I've talked about the show enough for you to figure out my thoughts on it. Obviously, I really like it. I don't really want to give too many thoughts on the show as a whole, as we're only 3 episodes away from an ending, so I'll save a good chunk of that for the season 3 video. Speaking of which, season 3 getting shortened to 3 44-minute episodes just kinda stinks. If this was a creative decision, then I'd actually be pretty excited for it, but as something forced by executives, it seems like a money-pinching decision that'll permanently hurt the show. Still, I don't think you should go into these episodes expecting them to be super rushed. While I will likely be a bit more forgiving towards them seeming a bit fast, the show still has over 2 hours of runtime to wrap things up, something that I think is possible. Not easy, but possible. As far as what my hopes for it are, I just hope we get to see as close to Dana Terrace's vision as possible. And the Luz and Amity date. This has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you next time for a better organized and much shorter video. Thanks for watching.